Hey there guys! So today I want to do room transitions, and we'll also just be importing a new tile asset so that we can work on building up a couple more rooms. So before we get started, I just have a couple notes. Firstly, with the collisions layer. So remember how we were taking great care with the order that we were placing all of our layers so that we would have the correct things drawing over each other? Well, for our collisions, these should really be at the very top so that they're drawing over everything else so we can see exactly where we're placing our collisions. But then we have, of course, this problem that, especially if we're trying to be really precise with our collisions, we can't see what's beneath them. And a couple people have pointed this out to me and given me a really good tip that I want to share with you. So if we just come into our collision sprite, we can change it from being this very opaque red square to something that is semi-transparent. So we can delete this, click on this little square here, and we'll turn down the alpha, and this will make it more transparent. So do something about that. We'll color that in, and if we come back now, but now we can see everything beneath our collision layers. Alright, so now that that's out of the way, we can start doing the room transitions for this video. And I just want to note that I've done a little bit of setup for this video. I've made a couple other rooms. I've made the house, the upstairs, and just a little blank forest area. And we're going to come into these. So here is the door for my house. I'm going to put a transition here, and I'm going to put a transition here for the forest. So for the house, I've brought in some new assets. I'll leave a link in the description for that. And I'm sure you know how to import assets by now. So you would import it here and call it SPR tile interior. Just looks like this. And then you would create a tile asset for the interior layer, and you would assign it the correct sprite there. You would make sure that the tile width and height are 32 by 32. Instead of 16 by 16 by default. And that should do you, and you should be able to get started drawing your houses. So I just want to note that I have put my house kind of in the middle here, as you can see. And I've added a backgrounds layer right here, and it's literally just a black square. But you do need this, you need something here. So it could be that color or whatever you want. Another note, and this one's quite important, I really should have mentioned this, but the order that you put your rooms in this little tree is important for what room your game is going to load when you run the game. And it's always going to run the room at the top here. So that should be your room 0. So make sure that you leave that here. It doesn't matter the order that you place the other ones in, but this one is important. So to make these rooms, what I did was I just duplicated the farm room, and then I would come here and I would delete all of the collisions. I would sweep out all of the stuff that I don't need. So delete that, come to the tiles, delete all the tiles. So if you just hit E, it'll change to the eraser, and then we can just erase everything in all of the layers. You would delete all the instances, except for maybe the player and the camera. So we'll delete all of them. And you would keep erasing everything. And I'll just fill it in with grass right now. So there we go. And then you can get rid of the stuff that you don't need. So for example, in my house layers, I didn't need layers 2 or 3, so I just deleted those. I didn't need the underground layer, and I just kept these. So set up a couple rooms like that. I'll just show you all of the width and heights of everything, because there is one important thing that is fun to do in games like this. So when we change from being outside to going inside a house or something, a lot of these games, they kind of zoom in a little bit. So what I've done is I have scaled up the camera. So in here, you can see I've made it 640 by 480. That's the size of this little room. And for the camera, so instead of being 750 by 420, I have halved that in the house and in the house upstairs to be 375 by 210. But most other things are the same. A little cute thing that I've done here is with the bed, I've added this layer here, and if I just hide that, so you can see the sheet is still there, and that's just so that when the player walks in front of the bed, it kind of looks like they're getting into bed. Very cute. But I did need to prevent the player from moving too close to that, or they would start clipping through, so you might need to put a chest here or something. So there's tons of ways to do that, and when we get more into object depth, which we still haven't done, if the NPCs and stuff are moving in front of and behind each other, we haven't really been managing that yet. That will come in a later video, so we might look at this later again. That's just how you would do things like that. You might also want to add additional layers if you're adding things to the table or something. You might also want to add something like an animated tile. So if we come into tile animation and let's add an animation, and let's come down to the fire, for example. And we'll just do, so you can set the number of frames you want for your animation. You can see they're in special multiples here, and that's just the way that it's kind of built to work. So we'll just go for 4. And let's grab here, 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 and we'll go back there so that it kind of loops. And we'll get a little fire here. I'm just going to turn down the FPS here. There's a few more in this little sprite sheet. So for example, I think there's a clock up here. So we could make this, let's say 8, and we could make it follow the gong as it ticks back and forth. So you know how they kind of, once they do the upswing, they kind of stay there for a bit longer. So we'll do 3 on the upswing, and then the middle, and then 3 there, and back to the middle, like that. There we go. And if we come back to the farmhouse, and we'll go into the, actually I'll make another layer, L1 objects 2. And so you can come into the libraries and you can click on the animation here, or you can just click on any one of the tiles, which is kind of cool because then you can like have multiple fires and they'll all start at different frames so that it looks a little bit more dynamic. And you might want to do this with something like torches. So if I play it now, you can see they're kind of different fires. Anyway, and we'll also add the clock. Okay, so now that all of that prep work is out of the way, let's close out of all of these. And for now, we'll just try and get from the farm room to the forest room. And I'm just going to delete that extra room. Okay, so we're going to create a new object, and when we collide with this object, we're going to make the room change. So we're going to go obj transition. I'm going to give it just the collision here, and we're going to have quite a few of these in the room. In fact, let's just make a new layer for it, call this transitions, and I'll turn off the collisions one. So we're going to have a couple of these. We're going to have one to enter the house, and we're going to have one to enter the forest. And they're going to want to send us to different rooms. So we're going to need different behavior depending on what instance it is. And a way to do this is using the creation code from within the room editor. So you can see there's a few variables here that are unique to this instance. We've got its scale because we've been scaling it up. And this one over here, you can see they're different. So if we set a variable, for example, we'll go target room, and we'll just set that to -1. And actually, I just want to do a little thank you shout out to Sean Spalding. I was watching one of his recent videos and he pointed out that if you just hit F8, you can zoom in and F7 zoom out and make the text a bit bigger. So it's a bit easier to read now. So anyway, if we make this variable, set it to -1, we can still come in here and then come into the creation code and we can change it for that instance. So I can set it, this one, its target room is going to be RM forest, right? So when we step on here, we want to go to the forest, and this one is RM farm house. Okay, and I'll add one also to the forest room so that we can come back. Whoops, need the new layer, transitions, to get back to the farm. And we'll set this one, target room to equal farm. Okay, so now we need to do the actual room changing. So there's 2 ways we could kind of do this. We need to detect a collision between the player and obj transition. Now, which object do you think we should put the collision checking code? So in terms of efficiency, if we put it in the transition object and we have maybe 5 of these in the room, they're all going to be running code checking for a collision with the player. But if we just put it in the player, then that's just that one object checking for a collision. So it's doing 5 times less work. So that's where we're going to put it. We're going to come into the player. We'll quit out of these rooms just to give us a bit more space. We'll come into the step event and scrolling down to the collisions. So right under all of this, I'm going to add another one, comment it as objects. And this is where we're going to put our collision code. So here we used the function placeMeeting to do our collision checking. And if you recall, what it does is it checks for a collision with another object at a specific XY location. And this function is going to return true or false, so that if our collision is true, then we do this, and if it's false, then we haven't collided. Now we're going to use a different function here called instance place. And this is very similar to placeMeeting. You can see we still give it an XY location and a collision with an object. So we can put X, Y, OBJ transition as normal. But this function doesn't return true or false. What it does is it returns an ID or no one. So basically what you're doing is asking, hey, am I colliding with any instance of OBJ transition at this location? If I am, give me the ID that I'm colliding with. And if I'm not, if no OBJ transition is at that location, then it returns no one. You're not colliding with anyone. So we can save the value that this returns. We can go var inst, and just like that, we're saving the ID of the OBJ transition that we're colliding with. And we need to do this because when we change our rooms, we want to move to the target room of that specific instance, right? So we have to find a way to get its ID, and this will do that for us. So now we say if inst, so if whatever this is equal to, so either an ID or no one, so if inst is not equal to no one, which means it is equal to someone, so we have found an OBJ transition we're colliding with. So if this is the case, we want to do a room change. So for now, let's just write room, go to, and now we just give it the room that we want to go to. So this will be the inst.target room, right? Remember, this operator is saying this variable that belongs to this instance. We're going to go to the target room of our instance. So that should be enough. So if we run the game now, let's check if that's working. So let's come over to the forest. There we go. And if we go back, so there we go, it's working. So there's still a few more things we have to do. You probably noticed that we've just spawned right back at the starting location of where we placed the player here. It's not like we're appearing right outside the room like you might be expecting. And we haven't told it to do that. So we're gonna have to set up some variables for that. And also we should do the fading between rooms. And I'm gonna do that one first. So what we're actually gonna do is we're gonna manage this from within inside the game object. The game's gonna manage this. And it's just going to draw a black box over the screen. And I'm gonna use the draw GUI event for this, because I don't want to draw it over the entire room. I just want to draw it over the screen. And you can do that using the graphical user interface layer. And just as a note, this layer it basically just covers the game window and it's entirely unscaled. So if you give it a coordinate from within the room, it's not going to match up to the GUI layer. So let's just draw rectangle. So we have to give it x1, y1, and this is the coordinate of the rectangle at the top left, and x2, y2, which is the bottom right. So we want 0, 0, because that's at the top of the screen. And then these variables are just going to equal the width of the GUI layer and the height. And we can get these values using a function. And so I'm just going to go into the create event and set up two variables, GUI width and GUI height. And this is just so that we only have to run the function one time at the start, and it will save the GUI width and height. There we go. And so now we can just put these in here, GUI width, GUI height. And for outline, false, we want it completely filled in. Actually, let's make this draw rectangle color so that we can say draw a black rectangle. So, and if you're wondering why it's asking for 4 different colors, that's just because you can actually have a kind of multicolored rectangle. So if you want to play around with that, then you can put in different colors if you like. I'm just going to keep it at black. So to do the actual fading, what we have to do is change the alpha of this rectangle. And we can use that using draw set alpha, and this will set the alpha of the entire draw event. So we're going to start at 0 and then fade up to 1, then we'll do a room transition, and then we'll fade back out from 1 to 0. So we're going to have to set this to a variable because we want to control it. So I'm going to call this black alpha. We haven't declared this yet, but I'm just going to put this in. And then we have to be careful. We have to remember to set this back when we're done, because otherwise the draw alpha is going to stay like this for everything that follows, which is not what we want. So we want to put that back to 1. So we'll start the black alpha off at 0, because obviously we don't want anything drawing. And then what we'll do is we'll be changing this up and down. So because the game object is going to be handling this, we can come back to the player and we're not going to be doing this anymore. So the player isn't going to be initiating the room change. But what it will have to do is pass off this variable to the game object. Because the game object isn't immediately going to change the room, it's going to have to fade out first, then do the room change, and then fade again. So it is going to need a way to store the target room of our instance variable. So we need to pass this off to the game object. So in the game object, we need another variable. We're going to call it spawn room. We'll just set this to -1 by default again. And so we need to set this to the transition object's target room. So here, we're going to go with the game object. We're going to set the game object's spawn room equal to this instances. So it kind of hopped into the game object, changed one of its variables and set it equal to the instance's target room. So now it knows what room we want to send it to. Okay, so one other thing we'll set up in here is do transition equal to false. So what we'll do is we'll wrap all of this room changing stuff, all of this fading in and fading out in if do transition is true. So we're only going to be doing this if it's true. By default, it's off. So in the player, what we'll do is when we have our collision, we'll also turn that on. So do transition equals true. Okay, and that is all the setup we need for handing off to the game. So it can take it from here. So we'll come back here. So now let's comment a couple sections. So this is the drawing the black fade. And here, we're gonna go handle, black fade, and room transition. Now, with the fading, there's kind of two cases. So we're gonna have, if the room that we're currently in does not equal the spawn room, then we haven't done a room transition yet, right? The current room does not equal the room that we wanna change to. So in this case, we wanna be increasing the black alpha. So we wanna be fading to black. So we're gonna go black alpha plus equals, so just a small number because it only goes from 0 to 1, remember. The other thing we want to do in this case is check if black alpha is larger than or equal to 1. So if we're completely faded in and we just put this greater than just in case it goes over 1. So if we've entirely faded in, then it's time to do our room transition. So we go room, go to the spawn room. So that's that step done. But if our room does equal the current spawn room, then we know that we've completed the room change and it's time to fade back out. So we go else black alpha minus equals 0.1. And once it's completely done, when the black alpha is less than or equal to 0, then we can turn off this entire code. We can stop drawing everything because we're totally done, and we can turn off do transition. Okay, so that should be it. Let's run the game and see if we're getting that fading. There we go. And there we go. So that's working. So the next thing we'll do is we'll fix that problem of the spawning locations. So when we're transitioning like that and we just pop right back here, we're going to need to set up two more variables, a target X and target Y, to spawn the player. So in our transitions, we'll call this target X and target Y. And this is just for the default object, of course. We'll have to change these in all of our individual objects. So this will take a bit of playing around because you'll have to check exactly where you want player to spawn. So if we come into the forest, and you can take advantage of this little thing right here. So this is sort of tracking the coordinates of the mouse in the room. So we can say that we want the player to be about here when it spawns. We don't want it to be right on top of the object because as soon as we enter the room, it's going to collide with this again and then pop right back. So we want it to be about here for now. 65, 370, I'm going to put. And for this one, we'll spawn about 970, 430. Okay, so that's set up, but we still need to pass this off to the game object. So in the game object, we're going to set up a spawn X and spawn Y. And we're going to add an event. And this is going to be the room start. So whenever we're starting a room, we're starting a new room, what we're going to do is move the player to spawn X and spawn Y. But remember, when we first start the game, our default values are just going to be these, and we're going to end up spawning the player over at 0, 0, and that's not what we want. So we're going to say if the spawn room is -1, if we haven't done any transitions yet, then just exit and don't do this. Okay, so that's set up, but we've got the spawn X and spawn Y for the game, and we've got target X and target Y for the transition, but they're not talking to each other yet. So what we need to do is come into the player, because that is the actual object that is mediating all of this and is detecting the collisions. And we have to pass these values off just like we did with the room. So we're going to change the game's spawn X to equal our OBJ transitions target X. And same for the Y. Y. Actually, one thing that we should add is we only want to do this once. As soon as we collide, we don't want to keep turning this on. We might get some problems. So I'm just going to say if we're not already doing a transition, then you can go ahead and do this. But if it's halfway through a transition or something, we might get some odd behavior if we try and start another one. So we'll just prevent that and say you can only do it if I'm not already doing a transition. Okay, let's have a look. Okay, so we'll come over here. There we go. Okay, so that's working. The next thing we're going to do is handle where the player is facing when it pops into another room. So if we go in here, you can see that it automatically is starting and looking to the left. We're going to set it up so that we can control the direction that the player is facing and have it facing the correct kind of way. So for this direction thing, not only can we make sure that we pop the player into the room so that they're facing the correct direction, we'll also make it so that the transition objects require the player to be walking in a certain direction to actually change rooms. And this is so that if we're just walking over the transition object, but we're not kind of going into the door, it'll still allow us to do that. And also so that we can spawn the player directly onto the transition object without it automatically just going to the next room. So the first thing I want to do is come into the game object. And I'm going to set up variables for us to use for direction. And this is going to be, we're going to use a thing called an enumerator. So an enumerator is kind of like a global variable, which means it can be used anywhere. And it kind of creates a data type. So we're going to call this dir, and then we're going to come in here. This is how we type it. And we can set up different variables here. And I'm going to have right, but I'm going to set this to be 0, up, going to be 90. Left is going to equal 180 and down is going to equal 270. And I'm doing this so that we can kind of set up an analog to the actual direction value in GameMaker. So if I just bring up the documentation for this, this is how it treats direction. So with 0 being right, 90 degrees being up, and it goes around like this. And some of you might remember this from fun times at school doing the unit circle. So now that we've declared it in the game object, we can actually use this even outside of the game object itself. So enumerators, like I said before, they have global scope, which means you can use it anywhere. So the way to access this is you would write dir dot and then a direction, and that would be equal to 0. So now let's come over to OBJ transition, and we're going to set up 2 more variables. We're going to have player facing before, and this is going to be the direction that the transition object wants the player to be heading in for a transition to actually occur. So we want the player to be facing a particular direction before we transition. And I'm just going to put -1 as the default value, and we'll change this again in the particular instances. So after, and we will have to come into our instances and we'll have to update this. So let's have a think. So this one's going to require the player to be heading to the right. And in the forest room, we also want it to come out facing right. So for this instance, they're going to be the same. So we write dir.right, dir.right. Okay. And well, then the one in the forest is going to be the opposite. We're going to want left. You can imagine there might be cases where these are going to be different. So for example, if I come into my house, if I had a transition object right here, so that's going to want the player to be moving upwards. And then when I actually come upstairs, I'm going to come out here. So I'm going to be wanting to face to the left. So that's a case where they would have to be different. But anyway, we're just working with the simple case for now. So just like before with the spawn X, we're going to have to pass these values off to an analog in the game. And I'm just going to call this spawn player facing. We'll start off at -1 again, because we'll be updating this when we have a transition. In the room start, this is where we're going to want to shift the player's position. So actually, we're going to have another value in the player, and we're going to call this facing. And I'll just set that to 0 for now. And in the step event, we're going to add some code so that we can get what direction that we're facing. So get direction player is facing. So we'll have to handle this in two cases for left and right and up and down. So we'll go if move X is not equal to 0. And I've put this here because it's right after we get the intended movement, but before we do the collisions. So if we're moving left or right, then I'm going to use another switch statement. So we're going to switch the sign of move X. So in the case that it's equal to 1, so if we remember sign is getting if move X is negative or positive, so it's going to return 1 or -1. So in the case that it's 1, we're going to change facing to equal the right and break. And in the case that it is -1, then facing is going to equal left. And we'll copy that else if Y, and we'll change all these. So remember, so the 1 for move Y is if we're moving down, because we start the origin at the top of the screen. So in the case that it's 1, we're going downwards and up. Okay, so this will change our facing variable to be equal to the direction right, left, down, or up, which is actually 0, 90, 180, 270. And then we're going to say else. So if we're not moving at all, we're going to say facing equals -1. Okay, and now we're going to change into the draw event. We're going to alter this here. So remember, this is the thing that was updating the direction of our character to draw. So for example, if I just click here, remember we were getting this frame for moving left, down, right, and up, and it would depend on how far down we are on the sheet. So now instead of updating the frames depending on our move X variable, we're going to update it depending on the facing variable. So we're going to do this as a switch statement. Again, so we're going to switch, so facing. Okay, so we're just going to copy this and we're going to put it in here and we'll just make our changes. So we're going to say, so in the case that facing is equal to left, then we're changing the Y frame to be that, and we'll keep going down like that. So right, up, and down. And finally, if it's -1. So remember, this was when we weren't moving. It was setting the frame to the idle. And I'm just going to tab these over. Okay, and I'll add the breaks in here. Okay, so we can get rid of all that now. So this is just shifting our system over to include our facing. So now our game object can modify our facing variable when we start up the room. So in our game object, we can tell the player to set its facing to be equal to this variable here. And again, we're going to need to pass this off. So we have to come into the player, into the step event, and set the game's value to equal the instance's player facing after, because that was the direction that we wanted the player to be in after the room transition. So now here with the actual collision, we have to say if we're not facing the correct direction, we're not actually going to go ahead and do this transition. So we're only going to do all of this. Let's say if inst is not equal to no one, and we're going to add another condition. We're going to say and. So if it's checking this and this passes, it's going to go ahead and check this other condition here. So and the direction that we're facing is equal to the direction that our transition object wants us to face. Then we'll go ahead and do all that. Okay, I think that's everything. But if we run the game now, it's not actually going to work. And it took me a little bit of time to puzzle this out. And I'm going to go through it with you guys because it requires an understanding of the event order. But so if you noticed, it's not working. I should be popping out facing right, but it's still facing left. And the reason is, so if you picture the order of all of our events, so if the game object at the very start of the room is changing the direction that the player is facing to be equal to this. So this is at the very start of the room. But then we still have all of the step events and the draw events to run. So there is a step event in between here and the actual drawing of the player in the correct direction. And this is going to give the player time to change this variable. And that's exactly what it's going to do here. Because if we're not moving, then it's going to change facing to be -1. Which means once we get to here, it's going to follow this and set the X frame, and it's not going to set the Y frame, and the Y frame is what we need to change for the direction. So this is the actual thing that's doing the work. So what we need to do is run this little thing here at the room start. So we'll grab this, go into the game, and then we'll just go with obj player, and we'll have it run its little switch statement. Okay, now we should be good. There we go. And just to make sure, I'm just going to change the spawn after to be up. Okay, so if I'm coming at it from another direction, if I move over it, it shouldn't do the room transition. So let's give that a try. There we go. And if I go right, it transitions. And there we go, we're also facing upwards, just like we told it to. And that means we're done. I'll leave you to set up the rest of the project as you want and the rest of the OBJ transitions. So now that we have the room transition system set up, we finally have everything in place to start doing our crop system. And I'm really excited about this because this is probably the most important part of the series. We're doing a farming RPG, so obviously the crop system is a very important mechanic. And I'll probably be doing this over multiple videos because there's a lot to go through and I want to make sure that you guys understand everything we're doing and I'm explaining all of the concepts. Especially because we're going to be using data structures, which often scares people away a little bit. But don't worry, I'm going to walk you through everything. So until then, take care and I'll see you next time.